he worked as a postdoctoral fellow at University of Birmingham for 3 years. So his research interests include design of cavitation reactors for water treatment. So he has a vast experience of that sector itself, and at the same time, synthesis of multi-phase fluids and biomass uh, polarizations. Okay, so he has published several publications. He has many publications to his credit, and his citations are certainly more than 600. So his current research was includes finding natural alternatives for surfactants, additives, stabilizers, etc. for synthesis of sustainable product for food and pharmaceutical application. But with very vast experience of water treatment, Dr. Mandar will be talking today on water treatment. So over to you, Dr. Mandar.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adinath sir, for a very kind introduction. And thank you, Somnath sir, as well, for obviously giving me this opportunity to present my work in this FDP. And again, like Kunde sir said, we would have enjoyed a offline session. We actually planned that, but unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we had to actually stick to the online session. But again, thank you all of you for showing the interest in this FDP. And again, I think sessions after lunches are a bit tricky, but still I think we have more than 50 participants. I think thank you all of you, for joining this session. I'll just share my screen quickly. Is it visible, sir?
Yes, it
Sir, it is visible. It is visible.
Okay.
Yeah. You can make it a full screen, sir.
Yes, sir. I'll just switch off my webcam because I may face some bandwidth issues, and then.
Sure.
Is it in the full screen mode?
Perfect, sir.
Yes,
Perfect.
sir. It is now.
Please go ahead.
Great, sir. Great. Thank you. Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Mandar Badve. I'm a DST Inspire faculty at Department of Technology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Today, I will talk about cavitation technology and engineering aspects in water treatment. So, this is mostly basically what I did during my master's and PhD studies. So, I worked on the cavitation technology and use of that cavitation technology for different water treatment applications. So, I'll be talking about that. So this is just a brief scope of my today's talk. So we will first see what exactly cavitation is, because I think some of you will already know what cavitation is, but some may don't. So we'll first start with what exactly cavitation is. Then we will see what are different physiochemical effects of cavitation. Then after that, we'll see actual case studies based on one of the type of cavitation, which is hydrodynamic cavitation. So we will cover that, what hydrodynamic cavitation is, during the introduction part. Then we'll see some theoretical studies, some CFD simulations, which we carried out to study different cavitational reactors. And then in the end, we'll see some future scope in this area. So this is just a brief of my sort of outline for my present talk, right? So basically, what exactly cavitation is? So cavitation is nothing but just a formation, growth, and collapse of vapor cavities which are present in the liquid when it is subject to a fluctuating pressure field. So that is just a definition of cavitation. If you have to just imagine some micro or nano size bubbles present in the liquid, and if these micro and nano size bubbles, they collapse violently, they create a very high pressure and temperature conditions, right? So that formation of these bubbles and then collapse of these bubbles, it happens because of the fluctuating pressure field or a velocity field, right? So that is nothing but a cavitation. Now, cavitation was, first observed by English Navy, during World Wars, when they were trying to build high-speed boats. So they developed a mechanism to drive this propeller at very high speeds. But what they observed is when they were driving these propellers at very high speed, they observed some sort of a corrosion or sort of a pitting behind these propellers, right? So they were not sure what exactly is causing this pitting, right? And because of this pitting and corrosion, the life of the propeller, was actually started to go down. So they actually achieved, building these high-speed boats, but at the same time they were actually losing on, they were sort of losing on their actually the propellers and sort of was increasing their maintenance cost and everything, right? But they were unsure, so nobody, observed this sort of behavior before that. So what they did is they invited scientist called Lord Rayleigh. So he was basically a mathematician from University of Cambridge. So he actually contributed a lot to our science. He even was awarded a Nobel Prize in Physics for discovery of densities of so many gases. And during that discovery, he also discovered argon as well. So for that discovery, he actually had already received a Nobel Prize, and he was, like I said, a mathematician in Cambridge. So they invited him to study this phenomena, right? So Lord Rayleigh, on invitation of the British Navy, actually studied this phenomena, and after his study, what he concluded that the gaseous bubbles which are present near the propeller, they experience a fluctuating pressure field due to velocity alterations, right? And when the pressure lowers, the bubble grow in size, and as the pressure recovers, the bubble shrink, and then your bubble velocity increases. And because your liquid inertia is very high, the bubble collapse, right? So what you can imagine is, imagine this is a propeller, which is attached to a, let's say, ship, right? So what basically propeller does is it pushes the liquid in this direction, which sort of drives the ship in the opposite direction, right? So when it sort of pushes the ship in this direction, what it does is it increases the velocity of liquid, right, in this direction, right? But when the velocity of the liquid sort of in this region increases, what happens is, we all have studied the Bernoulli's theorem in our 11th, 12th, and even engineering. So what happens is, when velocity increases, the pressure reduces, right? So when the velocity increases suddenly, this region where the velocity is very high at the tip and behind this blade, so there the low pressure region gets created, right? And when the propeller turns further, the pressure sort of recovers, and because of that fluctuating pressure field, like low pressure to high pressure and increasing velocity, the vaporous cavities gets formed, right? So Lord Rayleigh sort of studied this phenomena, and then he sort of along with Milton Playset, so they came up with an equation which is called as the Rayleigh-Playset equation. So this sort of actually is derived from a simple Navier-Stokes equation under the assumption of a spherical geometry. So geometry means here the bubble geometry or the nuclear geometry is assumed as a spherical, right? So they derived this equation, which actually tells because of the change in pressure field, how your bubble wall velocity and the acceleration actually changes, right? So from then on, the term cavitation became well known, right? So the initial, so these were sort of the effects, which were sort of estimated, that when the collapse of cavities takes place. So it was reported that the pressures up to 9,000 atmosphere, gets reached locally. Obviously not in the entire liquid, but the locally. And when I say locally, the size of these cavities is in micrometers, right? So you can imagine, if you have, let's say, a bulk liquid, when a single cavity collapse of, let's say, that up to order of 100 micrometers, so you get a very high pressure up to this 9,000 atmosphere, or maybe temperatures up to 4,000 kelvins, right? And because of this high temperature pressure conditions, what happens is, you get the radicals of the chemical species, or you get a liquid microjets, and this sort of creates very intense turbulence locally, and hence enhance the heat or mass transfer coefficients as well. So these were some observations which were reported by Rayleigh, and the initial efforts were only to actually avoid the cavitation, right? Because people already they only knew that this sort of causes has an adverse effect on their impeller or propeller. So therefore, initial efforts were only to avoid this cavitation, right? But actually, as an engineer, our job should be to actually not only control the phenomena, but to see whether we can use these effects in a positive way. Okay, So we knew obviously from the past experiences, obviously cavitation is bad, for the ship propellers, because obviously you observe corrosion, you observe pitting as well, and therefore it sort of reduces the life of these impellers and propellers. But can you actually use these effects positively? Can you actually utilize these effects in a positive way, right? So that should be the job of an engineer, not just to control the phenomena, but to use the effects in a positive way. And therefore in the late 80s, I think people realized this, that okay, wait, we can actually utilize this effect. Maybe we don't maybe some reactions which require very high temperature and pressure conditions, but what if we can actually carry out this reaction at a normal conditions, but we create these conditions locally, by just collapsing of this cavity, right? So therefore in the late 80s, people actually started thinking in that way. And I think in the early 90s, the very first paper actually came on the use of this cavitation, for to carry out the organic reactions, right? So this was published in Chemin Science from Professor Pandit and J.B. Doshi from UDCT Mumbai, where they actually studied the hydrolysis of fatty oils, and they actually carried out this hydrolysis using acoustic cavitation and hydrodynamic cavitation. We'll see how both are different, and we'll actually see it afterwards. But the idea is just to show that this was the first paper which actually came where the organic for example, this hydrolysis of fatty oils is generally carried out at higher temperature, but here in this work they actually showed that you can actually carry out these reactions at a normal temperatures and pressures, and still you manage to get a successful complete hydrolysis of this fatty oils, right? So the organic reactions which actually require rather extreme temperature and pressure conditions, they can be carried out at ambient conditions just by exposing the species to cavitating conditions, right? So here you can see just a small tank which actually contains an oil layer and a water layer, and the mixture actually passes through a pump, and the cavitation conditions were just created by throttling a wall, right? So we'll actually see how the cavitation takes place by just the throttling a wall or flow alteration, and then this mixture then again comes back into the tank, right? So you are doing nothing, but you are just circulating it in a loop. You are just allowing the liquid to actually pass through the wall and experience a cavitating condition. So basically, even though you are operating your reactor at ambient conditions, but your entire reaction mixture is experiencing this high temperature pressure condition when it actually passes through this cavitating zone, and therefore you actually manage to carry out these reactions even though at ambient conditions, but still at the same time you manage to generate those high temperature pressure conditions, right? So this was sort of the first paper which actually actually focused on the effectiveness of hydrodynamic, or effectiveness of cavitation rather, for to utilize it in a positive way. And afterwards, I think since that time, I think there are a number of applications which have been studied. So for example, people have studied cavitation for microbial cell disruption, where we also will see about the seawater disinfection. So we'll see that afterwards in a case study. Or people have used it for Borewell water disinfection as well, because obviously some of us obviously have we get the water from municipality at the villages and at some places we have been contaminated with bacteria. So you can actually carry out the borewell water disinfection by cavitation as well. I know a startup as well from ICT itself, from UDCT, where they are trying to disinfect this borewell water while it is coming out of the hand pump, right? So they are trying to generate this cavitation inside a hand pump itself. So while the water comes out from the hand, it is disinfected, right? So that's the application which has been widely studied. You can use in the industry, the cooling tower, how bad the problem is, because you get the algal growth, and because of that your efficiency of cooling tower goes down, and obviously because your cooling tower efficiency goes down, the entire plant efficiency goes down, right? So you can carry out that cooling tower disinfection as well, using cooling tower water disinfection as well, using cavitation, right? You can also utilize it for synthesis of oil in water and water in oil nano emulsions as well. I know some MNCs who are actually using cavitation to synthesize this oil in water, nanoemulsions are there, multiple applications. You can use it for nanoparticle synthesis as well. You can for silver nanoparticle, for titanium dioxide, for layer double hydroxide. There are different multiple examples. I am currently doing some nano starch synthesis. So we are trying to generate nanoparticles of starch particles and using this cavitation. Then again, our today's focus is wastewater treatment. So people have actually used it for wastewater treatment as well. So we'll see how basically cavitation can be utilized for wastewater treatment. So what happens is, like I said, these high temperature and pressure conditions which get generated in the cavitation, they result in breakage of your water molecules into hydrogen and hydroxyl radicals. So these hydroxyl radicals are highly reactive. So they are strong oxidizing agents, right? So what they do is they actually oxidize the pollutant molecule, and because of that, your COD or TOC of the wastewater goes down. Therefore it gets treated, right? So we'll see a number of case studies where we actually utilize hydrodynamic cavitation for wastewater treatment as well, and it can be utilized because of this high shear jets or high velocity jets. It can be utilized for increasing transport coefficient as well, for example, increasing heat transfer coefficient or mass transfer coefficient as well, right? So today we'll just focus upon majorly on wastewater treatment and microbial cell disruption, mostly in the case of seawater and the wastewater disinfection. And here we'll see about wastewater treatment, right? So today I'll just focus on two applications of cavitation, right? I just want to show you a very small clip, So as we know, the nature obviously has its own way to survive. If you look around us, most of the technologies, if not all, most of the technologies we use are somehow connected to or, inspired by nature, right? So we'll see how actually nature utilizes cavitation. So here you can see a front view of a snapping shrimp. It is a type of a shrimp which we found in the sea. So this is sort of a front view and this is a side view. So what basically a shrimp does is, when it sees a prey, as its food, what it does is he closes his mouth at a very high speed. This is obviously captured through a very high speed camera. This is therefore it is slow, but it actually closes his mouth at a very high speed. Because of that, a low pressure region gets created at the end, which sort of creates a high velocity jet, right? And when that velocity jet travels further, the pressures recovers, and then those cavities, they collapse, right? So you will see two phenomena here. When it actually closes his mouth, you will see a water jet, and afterwards you will see a collapse. See, this is a jet, and here you see a collapse, right? So because of that, what happens is, because of that violent collapse, the small fish or microorganisms passing through that, due to the sudden shock, they get killed, and therefore he gets his food, right? So this was basically a study carried out by Twente University in Netherlands, and they indicated that the snapping shrimp actually throws a cavity which travel a certain distance and then it sort of collapses, right? You can even see, this is a blackened, you can even see when it, in this video, a small light, when it actually closes, you can see after a fraction of a second a small light, if you can see it clearly there. So here you can see a smaller. So that is nothing but a collapse, right? So that is a sonoluminescence phenomena, that happens because of the violent collapse of this cavity, right? And then what they did in the laboratory, they actually measured the pressures, at this certain distance away from that shrimp mouth. They actually measured the pressure using something called as hydrophones. So hydrophones are basically used to measure this pressures in liquid. So you can see initially the pressure is almost constant, right? And just before the closing its mouth, the pressure actually slightly increases and then sort of goes below than it was normal. So this is the normal pressure condition. Then when it sort of closes its mouth and forms that velocity jet, the pressure actually goes down, and while collapse, the pressure suddenly increases. Right? So you can see the sudden increase in pressure. So this sudden increase in pressure is nothing but because of the collapse of the cavity, right? And then it sort of comes down, and then it slowly recovers as it travels further. right? So as you can see, even nature has its own way, to actually survive and how to actually. So we can see just the slide was just, to give you an glimpse of what exactly cavitation is and what, how exactly basically it happens, right? So what are some of the key effects, of cavitation? So basically, like I said, because of these high temperature pressure conditions, highly reactive free radicals get generated, right? We also get some localized intense pressure temperature conditions, and because of that you get a very concentrated energy at the location of the transformation, right? So like I showed you in that paper as well, so even though you are operating your reactor at ambient conditions, but you get at the site of the collapse, you get a very concentrated energy at the location of the transformation. Location of the transformation means where your collapse actually is taking place, right? And because of that you also get a very high intensity turbulence, right, which actually increases your transport coefficients as well. So overall, because of all these effects, you can actually observe the order of magnitude reduction in energy requirement for physical and chemical transformation, right? So you can imagine, like, if you want to conduct a reaction, let's say at maybe 100 atmosphere, or maybe let's say 500 degree Kelvin. You can imagine the amount of energy required for that. But let's say imagine instead of creating those high temperature and pressure conditions, you just operate your reactor at ambient conditions, but you manage to generate those conditions just by cavitating a liquid, or passing that liquid through a cavitation zone. So the amount of energy which you actually save in that is it's very high, right? So therefore you get an order of magnitude reduction, and we have actually proven that through number of literature papers, that the amount of energy, the reduction in energy requirement for this transformation is really very less compared to the conventional transformations. So this is just a schematic to actually show how the, like in the case of, let's say, nanoparticle synthesis or microbial cell disruption, how actually cavitation sort of phenomena work, right? So imagine you have a particle or a microbe, and imagine these are the cavities, right? So when these actually cavity collapse, what happens is, because of when they collapse, they create a very high temperature pressure condition, and because of those conditions, high pressure or high pulse conditions, your particle or microbe, it sort of gets breakdown. So particle obviously gets breakdown. In the case of microbe, it sort of implodes the cell wall, and because the cell wall of the microbe gets broken, all the intracellular material comes out, and your microbe eventually die, so that is what basically happens. So basically your cavity generates a very high pressure temperature, sort of pulses, shock waves, and those shock waves are responsible for disruption of or destruction of the particle, or disruption of a cell wall, which eventually results in disinfection, or which actually results in reduced your microbial count, right? But to actually that happen, it is not obviously as straightforward as I actually explained. What needs to happen is, so obviously your cavity should deliver sufficient energy to disrupt the cell, right? So obviously we say that obviously, let's say, cavitation takes place, but obviously it takes place at different intensities, right? Based on your energy input, the cavitation intensity will vary. So obviously your cavity should deliver sufficient energy to disrupt the cell, right? Or to disrupt any particle. Here I have just given an example of like a microbe, but you can consider it as a particle as well, or a molecule as well, right? Your cavity obviously should deliver sufficient energy to disrupt the cell, and the energy dissipated by that cavity should reach the microbe, right? Which means that they should be in the vicinity. For example, if your cavity is too far away from your microbe or a particle, and then that the energy dissipated by the cavity, obviously as it travels further, the energy obviously will dissipate eventually, right? So that energy dissipated by cavity should reach the microbe there, which means that both should be in the vicinity, and the microbe obviously should pass through the cavitation zone, right? Which is the same thing, that they should be in very close contact with each other, right? So these are some obviously important parameters, or important sort of conditions which must be satisfied in order for cavitation to actually disrupt the cell wall of the microorganism, which actually result in the cell death or microbe death, right? The similar concept applies for, like I said, particle as well, that the cavity should deliver sufficient energy to disrupt that particle. That energy dissipated by cavity should reach that particle, and same, they should pass through, particles should pass through the cavitation zone as well, right? So if all these conditions get satisfied, then only you get a sufficient, satisfactory result, right? And because of in order for that to happen, what you do is you pass that liquid through a cavitation zone continuously, like over the period of time. So what happens is, like, you pass the entire liquid through cavitating device once, twice, thrice. So you do on, you go on doing it continuously till you get your desired result, right? So these are some sort of conditions, or for to increase or to enhance the effectiveness of your cavitation operation, obviously based on your application. If you're talking about, let's say, just the wastewater treatment, so in wastewater treatment, what we want is that the cavitation should generate a sufficient energy to break water molecule into, let's say, this highly reactive hydroxyl radical. Then in that case, your obviously your first condition should be that the cavity should deliver sufficient energy so that it sort of forms your hydroxyl radical. And because these hydroxyl radicals are highly reactive, so their half-life is very short, it's a fraction of a second, right? Then your hydroxyl radical and your molecule, obviously they should be in a vicinity, so they should be in the in the vicinity of each other, so that it should quickly react with your pollutant molecule in order for it to oxidize, right? So, and in order to increase that probability or that efficiency, you keep on passing your wastewater through the cavitation zone, so that you get more and more oxidation and eventually more and more degradation of your wastewater, right? So this was for a physical phenomena. I already explained this. In order to achieve that, those chemical effects, which I said, that the free radical formation and the high temperature pressure condition. So that same phenomena should happen, that they should be in the vicinity, and it should generate a sufficient energy in order to actually create these conditions, right? Then and then only your free radical formation will take place, and then only you get some positive effects which you actually want to see, right? So these are some applications, like I said. So there are when it comes to type, there are major two types. There are 4 or 5 types of cavitation, but in terms of applications, and there are only 2 main types. The first is the acoustic cavitation, and the second is the hydrodynamic cavitation. So basically, acoustic cavitation is generated by a high frequency ultrasound, and hydrodynamic is generated by a sort of a flow constriction like Orifice or a Venturi, right? So how ultrasound works, so when sound actually passes through water, it sort of creates a low pressure and high pressure region, right? So there is a compression cycle and there is a rarefaction cycle, right? So what happens in the compression cycle, the low pressure region gets created. So when the low pressure region gets created, a nuclei, the dissolved gas which is present in water, because the pressure reduces, it sort of forms a nuclei, right? And as in the rarefaction cycle, as the pressure sort of starts to recover, these nuclei actually expand. It reaches a certain value, and then again, after a certain radius, when the pressure actually recovers in the case of rarefaction cycle, so the outside pressure it reaches very high compared to the inside, and then there is a sudden collapse, and that collapse actually creates a cavitating condition. So in the case of acoustic cavitation, that happens because of the sound waves, and in the case of hydrodynamic cavitation like Orifice and Venturi, that happens. So I will actually explain you how actually in the case of hydrodynamic cavitation, how actually cavitation basically takes place, right? So we'll see that I think in the next slides, right? So this is what basically happens. So there is a formation of a nuclei, it sort of expands, it reaches a maximum radius, and then bang, you get a adiabatic collapse, which actually results in those cavitational effects, which I already explained to all of you, right? So like I said, the acoustic cavitation, generally a simple ultrasonic horn is used. There are different types of flow cells and ultrasonic baths as well, but very commonly the ultrasonic horn is used. right? So if you, let's say this is your reactor and this is the ultrasonic horn dipped in it, right? Then this is the region where actually the cavitation takes place, right? This is the region where your liquid actually experiences the maximum effect of the ultrasound, right? So this is called as active cavitation zone, and the rest of the zone is the inactive cavitation zone, because here the liquid doesn't experience much of the cavitational effects or much of the the effect of ultrasound, right? So this sort of this can be also explained by the fact that, let's say this is your reactor, the entire reactor, out of which your cavitation zone is very small, right? So if you want to, let's say, handle a very high volume systems, then the acoustic cavitation devices are very ineffective, right? Because your active cavitation zone is very small, right? So for example, let's say this is your, just for an example, this is, let's say, your 1 liter beaker or 1 liter reactor. Then this will be of only, let's say, like 50 ml or 100 ml volume, where the liquid actually experiences the cavitation, right? So therefore, acoustic cavitation devices are, obviously they have a high intensity compared to hydrodynamic cavitation devices, but because they are ineffective at a larger scale, because your active cavitation zone is very low, right? They are only suitable when the reaction volumes are very small. Like for example, synthesis of nanoparticles, where your reaction volumes are very small, right? Your production volumes itself are very small. We are talking about like synthesis of grams of nanoparticles, or few grams, few milligrams. Then in that case, these sort of devices are very effective, because they have a very high, they create a very high intense cavitation conditions compared to hydrodynamic cavitation. But since we're talking about wastewater treatment, because today's agenda is mostly talk about wastewater treatment, I won't be talking anything about the acoustic cavitation devices. I just wanted to show you how actually these sort of devices work. Okay. In the case of hello, I'm audible, right?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. And in the case of hydrodynamic cavitation, there are again two different types. So first is non-rotary type, and the second is rotary type. So the non-rotary are sort of venturi, which is nothing but a converging and a diverging nozzle. Orifice is nothing but a standard orifice. So you have a plate with a small hole in it. So that's sort of a orifice plate, and you can generate cavitation in high pressure homogenizer as well. And in the case of rotary, you get high speed homogenizer. They are nothing but a stator rotor devices, where you have a stator which is fixed, and a rotor actually sort of rotates at a very high speed. So what happens is, because of this high speed, the velocity at the tip is very high, and because the gap between the stator and rotor is very small, it sort of creates a fluctuating pressure fields, and that sort of creates a cavitating conditions, right? So we will be talking mostly about the venturi based cavitation devices, orifice based, and the stator rotor devices in the case studies, right? So my focus for today's talk is only to actually talk about the effectiveness of hydrodynamic cavitation for the water treatment or wastewater treatment application. So we'll be focusing only on those today. Right? So here I will show you how actually cavitation, basically takes place in the case of non-rotary or sort of orifice, let's say orifice plate configuration, right? So imagine your liquid actually is traveling from left side to the right side, right? And this is a small orifice, sort of a flow, obstruction in your flow. So when the liquid actually comes, it tries to go through this very small hole, right? So here your cross sectional flow area is this much, but here your flow area suddenly reduces. So when your flow area suddenly reduces, what happens is your velocity suddenly increases, because your flow area goes down. So your flow rate is same, but because your cross sectional area goes down, your velocity increases. When your velocity increases, your pressure suddenly goes down, right? So we all have studied the Bernoulli's theorem. Your velocity increases, so pressure goes down. So when that pressure, so obviously based on your inlet pressure and based on your the ratio of your pipe to orifice size, the amount of pressure that actually goes down varies, right? But if the pressure goes below the vapor pressure of water, what happens is, we all know that at when the water reaches its vapor pressure, it boils, right? So when the pressure goes below the vapor pressure, because of the boiling takes place locally, so you get a very small vaporous cavities, right? Because of the low pressure region which gets created here. And then what happens is here your area again suddenly is increasing. So as your liquid travels further, the pressure sort of recovers, right? So here your pressure is very low. It reaches a vapor pressure. Let's assume it reaches a vapor pressure. Because of that, because the liquid reaches vapor pressure, the boiling takes place, and because of the boiling, you get a very small vaporous cavities. And when the pressure recovers, this cavity collapses, right? And because of that collapse, you get a very high cavitating, high intensity cavitating condition. So this is nothing but how you actually the cavitation takes place in a flowing liquid. Because the cavitation takes place in a flowing system, it is called as hydrodynamic, right? Dynamic because it's a flowing system, right? So this is how the hydrodynamic cavitation takes place in a simple orifice plate, right? You can generate this cavitation condition by just throttling a wall as well. Imagine if you just have a gate wall, and if you actually close some sort of percentage of a wall, then obviously the throttling takes place, and because of that, the cavitating conditions they get generated. Or you can do that through a venturi as well. So venturi will be nothing but you will have a sort of a converging nozzle and then sort of a diverging nozzle. So the principle is same. So you reduce the flow area and then you sort of increase the flow area. So in the case of orifice, that happens suddenly. In the case of venturi, that happens gradually, right? So if you have anyone have used this simple rubber pipes which we actually use to fill the waters in tanks, or to wash the cars, or to plant the water, you all must have observed that if you actually pinch the your opening of that tube, your actually water sort of creates a jet, right? So why that happens? Because you're reducing the flow area. The rate at which your water coming from your tap is same, but because you pinch your pipe, your flow area suddenly goes down and your water sort of comes out at a high velocity. It sort of creates a jet, right? Because obviously the pressure is very low in the tap. Obviously the cavitation won't take place there, but imagine the same thing happening at a higher pressures in a controlled condition. So that same thing happens, but because you reduce the pressure so much that it sort of reaches a vapor pressure, and then therefore you actually get a cavitating condition, right? So this is basically how the cavitation actually takes place, like I said, in the case of orifice or a venturi sort of devices. Okay, so this is basically the principle of generation of these cavities, right? So this just shows how the cavities get formed and they collapse. So in this region, you get the high temperature, pressure, high velocity conditions here, right? So how you actually quantify the cavitation, right? So if this is your orifice, this is your inlet, and this is your outlet. So if you just apply a simple Bernoulli's theorem, your pressure head and velocity head at 0.2 ideally should be equal to your pressure head and velocity head at the 0.3, right? If you actually neglect the frictional losses, right? And if you assume that they are at the same height, then the pressure head and velocity head at 0.2 should be equal to pressure head and velocity at 0.3, right? You can actually neglect the velocity at 0.3 because here your flow area is very small. So your velocity at the throat will be very high compared to the velocity at the exit. So you can actually neglect this term. And if you just rearrange your pressure head between the exit and the throat divided by your velocity head at the throat, ideally should be equal to 1, right? That the pressure head, difference in the pressure head should be equal to the velocity head here, right? So it ideally should be equal to 1. But when it is not equal to 1, then the cavitation takes place, which means that your velocity head is higher than your pressure head, right? So the velocity head here is more than your pressure, which means that the amount of energy here is not equal to amount of energy here. So some of the energy actually gets lost in this generation of these cavities, and dissipation of that energy takes place here, right? So when the sum of that the difference in your velocity, the pressure head is actually lesser than your velocity head, then the magnitude of this value will be less than equal to 1, and that is nothing but the cavitation, right? So ideally, when the cavitation takes place, this number is ideally less than 1. So when this number is actually less than 1, you can actually assume that the cavitation is actually taking place, that some of the energy that the sum of the energy which was present here is actually got dissipated for generation of this cavity. So that is how we actually quantify the cavitation. That you just calculate the pressure rates and the velocity head, and from that ratio you can actually quantify the amount of cavitation which is taking place. So obviously when CV is less than 1, the cavitation is taking place, and as it values goes down, which means your the velocity head is more and more compared to your pressure head. So as the CV is as it values goes down, the intensity of cavitation it gets on increasing, right? This is the formula for a cavitation number. Obviously it is a dimensionless. So your P2 is your record pressure, that is your downstream pressure. PV is your vapor pressure. So assume that the water actually reaches the vapor pressure, and V0 is the velocity at the orifice. So in the case of Venturi, it will be the velocity at the Venturi throat. In the case of Orifice, it is the velocity at the orifice, right? So like I said, the ideally CV should be less than 1, that the cavitation number should be less than 1. Obviously, the presence of dissolved gases and some impurities, they might result in generation of the cavitation for higher cavitation number because the dissolved gases and some impurities, the nucleation starts earlier, and therefore you might see cavitation as well at a higher cavitation number. But for maximum benefit, generally the thumb rule is that one should maintain the cavitation number to be less than 1, right? This is how the pressure profile, typical pressure profile of a orifice, of a liquid flowing through orifice, looks like. So these are sort of a streamlines. Imagine this is your orifice, this is your flow. So this is how the streamlines will look like, and this will be your pressure profile. So initially your pressure is constant, right? And the pressure, because of the geometry, sudden change in the geometry, the pressure slightly increases and then it sort of goes down. It reaches a vapor pressure where you actually, the flow area is minimum, that is at the throat. And then eventually as the liquid comes out of the throat, the pressure sort of recovers, right? And obviously your P2 will be less than P1 because otherwise there won't be any flow. So obviously that the recovery pressure will be always less than the inlet pressure. Right? So this is how the typical pressure profile looks like when there is no turbulence. Obviously, when there is a turbulence, the profile looks same, but just slightly distorted, right? But overall, the nature is same. That the initial pressure is constant, it sort of slightly increases, then it suddenly goes down, and then there's gradually increase, right? So this is how the typical pressure profile looks like. So far what we have seen is we have just seen what exactly cavitation is, what are the different types of cavitation. So we saw how and why hydrodynamic cavitation is better compared to acoustic cavitation for large scale obviously operations, because in the case of hydrodynamic cavitation, what happens is you can actually allow the liquid to pass through this orifice or a Venturi geometry continuously, right? So you can actually repetitively you can actually allow the liquid to pass through, and your entire liquid actually experiences the cavitation condition compared to the acoustic cavitation where only small portion of the liquid experiences the cavitation condition. So therefore hydrodynamic cavitation is always better compared to acoustic cavitation for obviously large scale operations. And we also saw that the cavitation number should be ideally less than 1 for for the maximum benefit, right? So here, because most of us, most of you will be unaware of what cavitation is and how that phenomena takes place. So I spent a little more time on explaining all of you what actually cavitation is. So here onwards, we will actually see the applications of this cavitation technology for the wastewater treatment, right? So if you have any doubts so far, just let me know. Otherwise, I'll just proceed, right? So if you haven't understood anything, just ask me now. Otherwise, I'll start with the actual application part of the hydrodynamic cavitation. Okay, I'm just assuming there are no doubts, or maybe I explained it very.
Yes, good afternoon, sir. Myself, Dr. Jain.
Okay.
Presentation is going too much deep technically. So most of the persons are from the different backgrounds. So if next part of the presentation will be some little bit technical, it will help all of us. It's going
Okay.
too deep.
Right. Okay. Okay.
I'm trying to understand from last half hour, but connecting is too deep. It's going too technical.
Okay.
Okay.
Because this phenomena is slightly different compared to the
This is
conventional
a different
technologies.
phenomena. I am also doing in this field and first time going through with this topic. Excellent topic and everything is, but the too deep and in the FDP we have a different background. Someone
Right.
from
Obviously.
science, someone from sociology. So for many of myself from the civil engineering background, but it too deep. In the last
Right. Okay.
8 day lecture, this is the deepest one. Okay,
Okay.
sir.
Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No, no. Here onwards, I'll just talk about applications and
Yeah,
how
then
actually
it's okay.
cavitation
Then
helps
it's
in.
okay. Then it's
Yeah.
okay. Sir.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So we'll first talk about the use of hydrodynamic cavitation for the ballast water treatment. So ballast water treatment is nothing but so if you don't know what ballast. So if you imagine this ship, let's say it's going from, let's say, India to Japan, and it has to drop, it has to deliver some cargo which is at the front end of this ship into, let's say, South Korea, right? Then what it does is it goes from India to Korea, and it sort of delivers some cargo. Now you can see the half of ship, the back of the ship has a more load because the front of the ship will be empty. Then what happens is, in that case, what ships do is, in order to balance the weight of the ship, they fill the ship at the bottom of the ship with the seawater, right? In order to just balance the weight of the ship equally, right? And then it will go from, let's say, after filling the ships with this ballast water, then let's say it goes to Japan, it sort of empties all the cargo. Now, in order to again rebalance the ship, they will discharge the water which they actually filled in, Korea, to again rebalance, right? So in that, what happened is, the water from, let's say, Korea, they are discharging into Japan, right? So what International Maritime Organization, so earlier they used to do that very frequently, but then there is a controlling body which is International Maritime Organization. What they said is, it is not allowed for you to discharge water from one country into the another country, because that was actually affecting the biodiversity. It was actually polluting the water. Let's say some country has more pollution compared to other, when the water from the polluted country was getting discharged into the non-polluted country, then that sort of was affecting the biodiversity of the sea microorganisms as well, right? So that water needs, so they had a control. They started putting a control on the shipping industry to actually treat that water before actually discharging into the sea, right? So that water basically is called as ballast water, and we'll see how we can actually use hydrodynamic cavitation, for treatment of that ballast water, right? So this is just a picture which I actually clicked last year. So you can actually see, so all those small green and red dots are actually the number of ships which were actually present in the sea at that time. You can actually see up to 6 to 10 billion tons of ballast water is moved around the world every year, right? If you can see, the quantity is very huge, and every day around 7,000 marine and coastal species, they travel unnoticed in these tanks, right? So that is why I said the problem is very vast. So you have to actually treat the billion tons of ballast water before actually discharging into the sea, right? So there are different, again, types of sea microorganisms. There are some zooplanktons, phytoplanktons, bacteria, and the concentration of again microorganisms vary from point to point. So I actually studied the seawater from Shivaji Park, Bombay, where the concentration was very high. So it was around up to 10 raised to 7 colony forming units per, just in 1 ml of seawater. There are again different treatment systems for this ballast water. So the pre-treatment is nothing. It involves sort of either filtration, magnetic separation, centrifugation, or hydrocyclone, in which filtration is very frequently used because it is again easy to use, right? So then there are physical treatments like thermal treatment. You just heat the water to actually kill the microbes, or you can apply ultraviolet irradiation. You can apply cavitation as well, or you can do deoxygenation, because if there is less oxygen, obviously your microbes will die, right? or you can do a chemical treatment as well. You can either chlorinate, you can either use ozone, or you can use some different biocide, right? Or you can use combination of treatments as well, right? So what we tried is we tried cavitation with chlorination, and we saw that you get 100% disinfection of that seawater. So we'll just see how we actually studied that through cavitation assembly, right? So here's the typical, sort of a cavitation assembly where you have a tank which actually contains seawater. You have a pump which actually has a suction line. So your seawater actually comes it into the pump. Then you actually discharge into, passes through a cavitating device, and then it again comes back into the pump, right? And here it actually, seawater, you are actually faces the cavitating condition where you are actually disinfection takes place. So we studied different sort of geometries of this cavitating device. The first is a simple circular geometry where you have a converging and diverging section which is of a circular cross section. Here also you have a converging and diverging cross section, but here it is a rectangular cross section, right? So the only difference between the circular and slit is both are venturies, the one having a circular cross section area and one having a rectangular cross section area, right? And the lens and the converging diverging lens, all they are different. They were optimized based on the CFD study. If I get time, I'll explain that afterwards. And we also studied a simple orifice plate as well, which actually I showed you how the cavitation actually takes place in the orifice plate, right? So we also studied the effect of different cavitating conditions on this disinfection. We studied the combination of different pH conditions and cavitation. We studied the effect of temperatures and cavitation, or we also studied the effect of chlorination on cavitation. Okay, so these were some just hydrodynamic studies. So where we observed that, so we actually calculated for different inlet pressures how the actually, obviously if you increase the inlet pressure, the flow rate the increases. So the red line actually indicates the flow rates for 3 different geometries, and based on that, obviously if your flow rate increases, your velocity will be more, and therefore your cavitation number will go down, right? Therefore, with increase in the inlet pressure, the flow rate will be more, and your the pressure, obviously the effective cavitation number will be lower and lower because of that, right? So for different inlet pressure conditions, we saw for 3 different geometries, obviously we got different disinfection efficiency. So even though the inlet pressure is, let's say, same. So let's say, for example, your inlet pressure is just 2 bar, right? So inlet pressure is 2 bar means the amount of energy which you are putting in is same, right? But just by changing the geometry, the disinfection which you get in all the 3 geometries is different, right? So here, for the case of orifice, we only observe 10% disinfection, whereas if we just change it to circular geometry, we observed around 20% disinfection, whereas for the slit type of geometry, we observed 40% disinfection, right? So which was very interesting. So the amount of energy which we put in was constant, but we just changed the geometry of these devices, right? And just by changing the geometry, because of that, the amount of cavitation that takes place inside those geometries, they actually change, and because of that, the intensity actually varies, and therefore the overall efficiency was different as well, right? And we also observed that, like, initially it sort of the overall disinfection sort of initially increases with the inlet pressure, and then it sort of goes down, right? So that happens because of something called as choked cavitation or choking of cavitation. So we tried to actually get photographs of of this cavitating conditions under different pressure conditions, from, let's say, pressure 1 bar to 10 bar. So we had images at different pressures. So here you can see initially if you observe just this central axis of this venturi, so initially it's a clear zone, right? If you increase the pressure, let's say from 1 bar to 5 bar, here you see some small, sort of some sort of cloudy sort of water, right? But if you increase the pressure further, that cloud, actually the intensity of that cloud formation is very high. So you can call that as a cavity cloud, right? So here, if you increase the pressure further, that cloud even gets denser here, or even high here, right? So from a very low pressure to high pressure, you can actually see that that cavity cloud formation takes place. And when that cavity cloud formation takes place, what happens is your intensity of collapse reduces. Why? Because your collapse of one cavity gets dampened by the collapse of another cavity, because you have so many cavities inside your cavitation chamber, that the overall intensity goes down, because that the intensity of one cavity gets absorbed by the other cavity. So actually, therefore, your efficiency goes down. Therefore, we observed that initially, even though the disinfection sort of increases, then it sort of decreases as well. Therefore, it is also important to actually operate your cavitating devices at optimum condition. That is what it tells us, that it doesn't mean that you should, even though your cavitation number goes down theoretically with increase in pressure, you should also focus on operating cavitation device within that pressure range, so that you don't get over cavitation as well, or we call it as a choke cavitation as well, right? So here also same thing. So we just plotted that. So C by C naught is your initial microbial count, and C is your microbial count after the end of experiment. So all the experiments were carried out for the same time, right? So as you can see, as the amount of input energy increases, the overall disinfection efficiency sort of increases, and the highest energy efficiency was observed for the case of the slit venturi, where for the lowest input energy we saw the highest disinfection, right? Here also, which I think explained already. So let's say if you are talking about input energy of, let's say, 14 megajoules per meter cube, so if for that particular energy input, just by changing the geometry, the amount of disinfection efficiency which you observed was different, right? The orifice, it is lowest, circular, it is somewhere in between, and the highest energy efficiency was observed for the case of slit geometry, that rectangular geometry, right? So just by changing the geometry for same input energy, that disinfection efficiency, sort of changes. So that was a major outcome of this, sort of study, right? Then we also did a combination of pH as well as cavitation. So here we observed that as pH increases, the amount of disinfection sort of increases, and the combination of pH and hydrodynamic cavitation sort of results in slightly higher disinfection, because obviously at a higher pH condition, the hydroxyl radical causes destruction of the phospholipids, which are structural component of the cell wall, and because of that destruction of those lipids, the cavitation efficiency increases, right? Then we also studied the effect of different temperature conditions on cavitation, and we saw that as the temperature increases, obviously if you just see only effect of temperature, then from 30 to 60, obviously the disinfection increases. But you actually, in all the cases, if you actually combine these effects, combine cavitation with temperature, in all the cases the efficiency increase, right? At 30 degrees centigrade, the efficiency increase from 2 to 44. At 40 degree, it goes from 5 to 45. Similarly, at 60 degrees centigrade, only 60 degrees centigrade results in up to 70% disinfection. But if you actually combine that 60 degree with hydrodynamic cavitation, so you get almost 100% disinfection just in 15 minutes, right? Why that happens is because obviously higher temperature sort of makes cell wall lucid, and therefore that helps in disruption. So that because your cell wall is more lucid compared to what it is at the normal temperature, it breaks very quickly, and because of that the disinfection sort of increases. Then we also did some combination studies with chlorination as well. So here also we observed that if you actually combine cavitation with chlorination, the efficiency sort of increases. So for just 5 ppm of sodium hypochlorite, which is the standard disinfectant used in for industrial wastewater treatment. So for that 5 ppm of chlorine with hydrodynamic cavitation, in 15 minutes you again get almost 100% disinfection, right? So in general, if you're just talking about just chlorination, then in that case, for this sort of seawater disinfection, you need around 15 to 20 ppm of hypochlorite, for effective disinfection of seawater, right? So using combination of cavitation along with chlorination, you require almost 2 to 3 times less hypochlorite solution, which is also again advantageous, because you can't use very high concentration of chlorine as well, because that has its own hazardous effects. You get a very hazardous chlorination byproducts. So the idea is to utilize less and less chlorine, right? If you actually combine chlorination with cavitation, then obviously you will get much more benefits. That is more sustainable. So the effort should be to actually utilize cavitation with conventional treatments, to make your process more sustainable. So if someone is using, let's say, only chlorination, for even we are trying it. We were actually trying it for swimming pools as well, because most of the community swimming pools which we see around, they use chlorination, right? So we were actually doing trials to actually check if you are actually using certain quantity of chlorine, if you actually combine, because in swimming pools as well you need pump, right, in order to actually get the water from pool and then to pass it back again in the pool, and you carry out a filtration in between. So we were actually trying to fit the cavitation device in between, and actually the idea was to actually reduce the amount of chlorine which is generally used, right? So that way it is more sustainable. If you actually use cavitation along with a conventional treatment, then it is more sustainable and more effective in my opinion, almost for most of the applications, right? So this is just a survival rate. So we just plotted it, and we observed that it actually follows the first order kinetics, with respect to time, that the disinfection rate or survival rate of the microbes. Okay. We also then studied the effect of steam-induced hydrodynamic cavitation. So similar to high temperature or chlorination, we actually introduce steam in the wastewater, because most of the ships, they generate a lot of steam to actually drive their engines. So they have a surplus of steam as well in the ships. So that was one of the idea behind using this study. So we actually generated a steam, and we actually passed that steam, at the throat of the venturi. So obviously here the geometry was slightly different, and we saw that when you actually combine cavitation, so here so this is without steam, you get roughly around 33% disinfection, and with steam, just the 1 bar pressure, obviously it was, because it was done at the laboratory scale, the pressure of the steam was very low, and the pressure of the water was very low as well. But we observed that almost 30% increase in disinfection efficiency was observed by combination with steam, right? So it was observed repetitively through number of studies that if you use cavitation with some other technique or with conventional technique, the efficiency, it goes down significantly, right? So these are some conclusions that the rectangular geometry is better compared to circular and orifice. So the idea is actually, just by keeping your input energy same, if you just alter a design of your cavitation device, the efficiency will increase, right? And combination of, like I said, the chlorination or steam along with the cavitation sort of increases the rate of disinfection compared to that of the conventional chlorination. Okay. So here the second study I will talk about is the industrial wastewater disinfection. So here we actually collected a water from a government organization, a big industry in Mumbai, where they actually wanted to disinfect their wastewater, and they were exploring, because they had a surplus of wastewater, they wanted to disinfect that wastewater and use that wastewater as a surplus water for their cooling water, right? Because if it is disinfected, then irrespective of its COD, it can be used as a cooling water, right? Because if it is not disinfected, it sort of forms a fouling and scaling and reduces the efficiency. The idea was just to disinfect it and maybe try it as a cooling water, right? And the idea was to specifically reduce the bacterial count to prevent the likely biofouling. So that was the major objective, to prevent biofouling of this wastewater, right? So again, similar type of setup was used, like I explained the previously. So this was the circular type of venturi was used, and the orifice plate was again used. So here we observed that, so we collected actually the water from two different regions. The first was the input basin, and the second was the output basin. So here for the input, we carried out, with the case of venturi as well as orifice, here we carried out only with the venturi type of device. So we observed almost 78% reduction, in bacterial count in the case of venturi-based devices, right? Then we used the combination of biocide, because they had their own biocide which they were actually using for disinfection. Then we actually tried to, did the experiment with biocide and without biocide as well. So this was before biocide addition, only hydrodynamic cavitation. So we observed that with only hydrodynamic cavitation, we observed almost 98% reduction in that sulfate reducing bacteria. So these are the main bacteria which actually contribute majorly to the biofouling, right? Therefore, we actually focused on these specific bacteria as well. We obviously measured the total bacterial count as well, which was, the reduction was around 80%. but they were actually more interested in to measure the concentration of the sulfate reducing bacteria, and only with the cavitation we almost achieved the 98% reduction in that particular wastewater which we actually collected, right? So the run 1, run 2, run 3 only signifies the water collected at different days, because obviously the initial parameter were varying, so therefore did it for 3 different days, right? And this was with biocide. So here we actually, the samples containing biocide were kept for 1 day to see the effect of biocide, and then were subjected to hydrodynamic cavitation, right? So what we observed is after 1 day, almost 97% reduction was observed in this sulfate reducing bacteria as well, but the total bacterial count was only 34%. But in the case of here, it's only 16%, right? So which we actually increased it to up to 75 to 80%, right? So here, like I previously said, here also we observed that the combination of this biocide and cavitation proved very useful, and then the company was actually very interested with the result, and they eventually managed to actually put up a cavitating device for their wastewater disinfection, and they are actually currently also, I think, using this cavitating device to disinfect their wastewater, and they are using it for their cooling tower, right? So here some back of the envelope calculations, we actually calculated the cost as well, and the cost of that treated water by cavitation was coming out to be around ₹8 per meter cube of water, which was actually considerably lesser than the actual fresh water which you actually have to buy from the municipality, right? Therefore, actually, because it was economical as well, the company actually decided to put up that cavitating device for their wastewater disinfection, right? So in my last case study, I'll talk about different actual wastewater treatment strategies. Here also, again, the same type of device was used. So here we studied the degradation of the reactive red dye, which is a typical textile dye, which is used in the textile industry. So again, we observed that if you increase the inlet pressure, the disinfection efficiency increases. Here the efficiency is plotted in terms of the rate constant. So we observed the first order kinetics of this degradation, and we observed that the rate constant actually increases with increase in inlet pressure, and like we observed before as well, after a certain pressure, it sort of the efficiency sort of goes down. That happens because of that super cavitation condition which I told you about, right? But again, if you see, with only cavitation, if you actually measure the total organic carbon of that particular wastewater, if you see the only cavitation, not up to only 20% reduction in that total organic carbon was observed, right? And when we actually combined that with the hydrogen peroxide, almost 60% organic carbon was degraded, right? So here also we observed the same thing, that when we actually utilize that cavitation with the hydrogen peroxide, the percent reduction in the total organic carbon again increased drastically, right? So in this study, we actually did the experiment with actual wastewater from a pesticide industry effluent. So here also we observed that compared to only cavitation, when it was combined with hydrogen peroxide and when it was combined with ozone, the amount of COD which was reduced was more, right? As you increase the hydrogen peroxide concentration, the degradation also increases, and the highest degradation was observed when we actually had 10 grams per liter of hydrogen peroxide, along with obviously cavitation, right? And for ozone as well, as the concentration of ozone increases, the combination of the total degradation of the COD also increases, right? But in the case of hydrogen peroxide, the increase was very highest, up to 90% reduction was observed, whereas here only like up to 50% reduction was observed, right? If it comes to the cost of electricity and the cavitational yield, as you can see, the cavitational yield is nothing but that the moles of effluent are degraded per joule of energy which was supplied. So that energy supplied was calculated from the pumping energy, and the moles of effluent degraded were calculated from the COD, right? So you can see if you combine cavitation with, let's say, hydrogen peroxide, your yield also increases, right? So from 0 moles of 0 grams per liter of hydrogen peroxide to 10 grams per liter of hydrogen peroxide, the yield almost increases 5 times, right? And your cost of electricity almost also decreases from 10,000 rupees per meter cube. The cost comes down to only around 2,000 rupees per meter cube, right? So therefore, it is very like it proves to be very sustainable economically as well, right? So obviously, your yield also increases. At the same time, your cost of electricity or treatment cost also goes down, right? Same thing was happened like observed in the case of ozone as well, but in the case of hydrogen peroxide, that because hydrogen peroxide is more reactive compared to obviously ozone, so the efficiency of hydrogen peroxide was observed more compared to the ozone based operation, right? And in the last, we actually did another wastewater treatment study where we actually treated a wastewater from a wood finishing industry in Hungary. So there, I was there for like 2-3 months to carry out this research work. So the wastewater contained different adhesives, UV stabilizers, lacquers, paint, varnishes, and the traces of those. And it had an initial COD of around 38,000. They wanted it to reduce below 10,000 for a safe discharge, right? So we actually tried to do it with the cavitation. So here it's a different type of a geometry. It's a stator rotor type of a geometry which I told you about. So you have outside you have a stator which is a stationary, and inside is a rotor. So this rotor has different indentation on its surface, like shown here, and you have a very narrow gap between this stator and a rotor, right? So the liquid actually comes from this side. So liquid actually comes from here. So this is a narrow gap between the blue is a narrow gap between your stator and rotor. This is your surface of the rotor. So what happens is liquid comes here because the rotor is rotating at a high speed. It sort of enters that indentation. So this hole, call it as an indentation. So it enters the hole at a very high speed, and because of the movement of that rotor, it again comes out, right? So when that liquid comes out at high speed, it sort of creates a low pressure region here, and it creates a cavitating conditions, right? And because of this cavitating condition, wastewater, sort of gets degraded. So this was a different type of a setup. So here also you observe that with increase in the speed, your cavitation number or your velocity increases and your cavitation number again goes down. So which cavitation number goes down means your efficiency of cavitation increasing, right? So we did experiments again with multiple speeds of the rotor. We observed that as you increase the speed, your COD reduction increases as well. So obviously higher the speed, higher degradation was observed. Similarly, we checked the different residence times, like by just changing the position of the wall, and we observed that obviously because the amount of time your liquid spends in a cavitation reactor obviously will affect the efficiency. So that also was observed that if you actually increase the residence time, your efficiency of the reduction actually again increases too. Here also we studied the effect of cavitation on hydrogen peroxide as well. We also observed almost 83% reduction, in COD value when almost only 5 grams per liter of hydrogen peroxide which was used, and it was well below what they actually wanted. So they wanted to reduce it below 10,000. We actually managed to reduce it up to like 6,000, 7,000 just by using cavitation and this 5 grams per liter of the hydrogen peroxide. At higher concentration, the efficiency of it slightly reduced, because at higher concentration, because hydrogen peroxide is highly reactive, it sort of has a scavenging effect, and it is very well known. Therefore, it sort of goes down. Therefore, it is also necessary to actually optimize to use this sort of oxidants effectively as well. Okay. This is just a cavitation yield which was actually calculated. So we observed that when the hydrogen peroxide was used, so yield of around 0.022 milligrams COD reduction was observed per joule of energy consumed, and we observed that the hydrogen peroxide actually enhanced the yield of cavitation by almost 40%, right? So only cavitation it was around 0.022 milligrams of COD per joule. So with hydrogen peroxide it was around 0.034 milligrams of COD per joule of energy, right? So we also observed an increase in the yield, and obviously because of that your cost also again the operational cost also goes down because of that. Okay. So these are some conclusions from this wastewater treatment study. So we observed that the extent of COD removal of the wastewater was found to be obviously depend on the speed of rotor or the inlet pressure. So that sort of decides your intensity of cavitation, and then it sort of decide that the overall the intensity of your operation. Then the addition of hydrogen peroxide or ozone enhances the rate and extent of COD removal. So obviously the combination cavitation is more sustainable because of that when it is actually used in combination with the other oxidant, right? And this is my last case study. I know the topic is on the wastewater treatment. I just included it because this was another application, which was actually studied, which actually turned out to be very sustainable compared to the conventional treatment. Therefore, I sort of included it. I will very quickly run through that. So we actually used cavitation for the delignification of wheat straw. So initially we took a wheat straw. It was actually fed to the chopper to actually reduce the particle size to up to 5 millimeters. The average size was 5 millimeters. Then we added 0.5 molar of potassium hydroxide as an alkali agent, which is actually responsible for the alkaline hydrolysis. Then the pre-softening of that wheat straw was done at 48 hours, at room temperature, and in between we did disintegration of wheat straw, every 12 hours at 2,500 RPM in a standard laboratory disintegrator. And then we, of that pre-softed, alkaline hydrolyzed wheat straw, which was actually, we subjected to cavitating condition, and then we actually made a paper out of it. So we actually did the delignification, and then from that delignified wheat straw, we actually made paper sheets, and then we actually studied the properties of those paper sheets, right? So again, the similar setup was used, which I already talked about. So here, like I said, the alkali concentration was fixed. We did experiments at different speeds. The total treatment time was only 15 minutes. And like I told, so after delignification, we actually made the paper sheets out of it, so it's the standard paper sheet making machine, you just feel the water fiber suspension here, then it, dilute it with the water, then you sort of bubble it to disintegrate any, clumps or something, then you allowed the water to fall through, and then you sort of apply vacuum, and then you, after applying vacuum, you get a very thin sheet, which is very wet, obviously, and then you sort of remove it, and then you dry it under vacuum, right? And then you get a paper sheet, right? And that paper sheet was actually cut into different pieces, and it was actually using a standard universal testing machine. We actually measured that tensile strength and tensile index of those paper sheets, which were actually made after the cavitation treatment, right? So these are the we observed is, if you actually hello, I think I lost my connection. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're
Okay.
you are
Yeah,
back.
sorry.
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay, yeah. So what we observed is, if you when you actually increase the speed, the tensile strength obviously increases, because obviously at higher speed the cavitation intensity was more. So in each case the tensile strength sort of increase. The consistency is nothing but the percentages of wet percent of each straw to the water. So 5% consistency means 5% straw and 95% water, right? So there was no sort of change in between different consistencies, but in each case, with increase in the speed, we observed that the tensile strength and tensile index both sort of increase with the speed, right? And tensile index also as well of that paper sort of increases with the treatment time, and highest, because we did it only for 15 minutes, the highest index was observed for 15 minutes, for both the speeds, right? And this tensile index, which we obtained at around 5,000 newtons per meter, it is actually sufficient. If you actually compare this tensile strength value for the standards, the ASTM standards for the newsprint paper or the paper board, which is used for different sort of packaging, it is actually sufficient for that type of paper. So you can use that delignified wheat straw after cavitation, for manufacturing of these newsprint or paper board manufacture, right? And in terms of actually, if you actually try to calculate that electrical energy per order, so it is nothing but that amount of electrical energy required to have an order of magnitude change in the concentration, right? So here the concentration is nothing but a concentration of lignin. That is what we assume, right? So if you actually calculate that electrical energy required for hydrodynamic cavitation, and if you actually compared it with the standard, kraft pulping or steam explosion which is used conventionally for treatment of this straw. We observed that the energy required for cavitation is almost 50% less compared to the conventional treatment, right? So therefore it is very sustainable if your objective obviously is only to manufacture it for the paper board, right? So for the same type of paper, if you compared the kraft pulping or steam explosion with cavitation, the energy required is almost 50 times less. Right? So therefore, because we observed that the cavitation proved to be very sustainable in the case of delignification. Therefore, the only case study which I added here apart from the wastewater study. Right? So these are some of the conclusions. Obviously, depending on the properties of the final paper required, it is easily possible to optimize the process parameters such as your solid to liquid ratio, concentration of the alkali, time of operation, type of cavitating devices. Because that was a very preliminary study, we just wanted to see whether what type of paper we get. So these parameters were not varied, but one can actually vary these different parameters and one can actually get different types of paper, paper of different properties based on the final application, right? And obviously the cavitation requires significantly less energy as compared to the other conventional techniques for the delignification. So these were the case studies which I actually wanted to cover, for today's talk, obviously based on to actually showcase the potential of hydrodynamic cavitation for different types of wastewater and what are the potential uses of it. Right? I have some CFD simulation results, but I'm not sure about the time as well, and I don't want to. I know it was already too technical. I don't want to make it too technical, so therefore I don't think I should cover it. So I mean, these were just included just to show. I'll just quickly. We basically compared the CFD simulations of the circular geometry and the slit geometry, right? So if you remember from the first case study, circular is nothing but which has a circular cross section, and the second one is rectangular, which has a rectangular cross section. So we just sort of compare the CFD simulations of two different geometries, and I'll just come to the end. These are different pressure recovery zones based on the length and width ratio of that rectangular geometry. Yes, so I'll just compare the circular geometry with the rectangular. So there are three different types of rectangular geometry and one circular geometry which was actually compared for the same inlet pressure. If you actually see that there are different pressure recovery zones. So pressure recovery zone means you get a lower pressure obviously at the throat of the venturi, right? So the amount of length it actually requires to recover that pressure completely is nothing but the pressure recovery zone and the theoretical number of cavities, right? So you see in the case of rectangular venturi, you get more number of cavities compared to the circular geometry, and that recovery zone is also very small. So what does that mean is you get more number of cavities and they recover very fast as well. So therefore you get a very violent collapse, or you get a very intense cavitating conditions, because you have more cavitational events and they recover very fast as well. So that is what so that was actually, so this CFD study was basically, this is what we observed experimentally as well. For this type of geometry we got highest efficiency. This was just to actually confirm that experimental observation with the CFD simulation. So that is what we observed through this study as well, right? And these were some very technical conclusions of that CFD study, that if you increase actually that perimeter to throat. So these are very, I don't like I said, I don't see any point in going through that. If someone has any interest in this CFD study, they can actually later contact me and then we can actually discuss those. Right? These are again some conclusions of that computational fluid dynamic study. I won't go. So overall, I will just conclude regarding cavitation that obviously the cavitation number should solutes are present, cavitation can occur at cavitation number really less than 1. One should always operate at higher inlet pressure, which results in more intense cavitation, and increase in the inlet pressure should be till an optimum value, because like I explained, if you increase inlet pressure very high, you get those cavity cloud and then the intensity sort of reduces, right? The onset, like I said, or the onset of super cavitation should be avoided. use plates with like orifice plates. If you're using orifice plates, use plates with smaller size or orifice, of the orifice holes, and large in number to get obviously maximum number of benefits of shear layer. In order to select, while selecting cavitation device, an orifice flow configuration is necessary only for intense chemical reactions, and for milder processes, requiring pressures typically between 15 to 20 bar. And for physical effects, of Venturi configuration is more suitable as well, right? So here, even the pressure values are, like still very high. Like currently, what we have observed is even at around 2.5 bar, we are also getting some, obviously for different applications. For nanoparticle synthesis, we have observed that even at 2 to 3 bar pressures, we are getting currently as well the nanoparticles using hydrodynamic cavitation. So obviously again depends on application to application, the pressure and geometry can vary. To increase the if you want to increase the cavitational intensity, so with the Venturi length, again this is very technical. For you can change the geometry. Like I said, your input energy can be same, but by just altering the geometry, so there are different combinations, which one can use to have maximum effect. So these are some conclusions I think from that, and I think thank you all for your attention. I apologize if it was very technical, because the topic given to me was use of cavitation technology for water treatment. So I thought it was appropriate for me to explain what cavitation is and then actually come to its application part. So therefore, if it was too technical, again I apologize, but I hope some of you at least enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It is technical, but as per current demand of current scenario,
Yes, sir.
it has a significant.
Dr. Mandar, this now is a excellent example with the things. So now it's much enjoyable in the second part of the presentation. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shailendra, for your kind remarks. Yeah, so the session is now open for questions, Q&A. Yeah, so if anyone has any question, they can please unmute themselves and ask the question. I'm just looking at the chat box if there are any questions. No, I don't think there are any. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, Shweta ma'am.
Yes, good afternoon. It was really very nice technology instead of using chemical technology, because I belong to field of chemistry. I find it very useful that after cavitation only we can just reduce the BOD, TOs, CN, many things can be reduced. It was really very informative talk, sir. I just have two queries in my mind, sir. One is regarding the ultrasound cavitation is either useful or more useful, or the hydrodynamic.
Yes, ma'am. So again, it, like I said, it
For the
depends on.
purpose of wastewater.
For the purpose of wastewater, if you ask me, the hydrodynamic is more useful, because acoustic you can't actually, if you're talking about the scale-up aspects, it is not useful, because you can't scale it up very easily, because it requires a very high energy, right? If you are just talking about an exploratory study, if you just want to see whether that wastewater can be treated by cavitation or not, then it is an excellent study, because sometimes we have done that. Sometimes we used to get only, from industry, we used to get only 1 liter of sample to actually see whether cavitation, can be applied or not. Then in that case, we used to actually do ultrasonic cavitation just to check, whether cavitation conditions can degrade that wastewater or not. So in that case, it is very useful. Right? But if you're talking about implementing the technology at an industrial scale, then obviously you will have to operate using hydrodynamic cavitation, where your minimum volume requirements are at least 3 to 4 liters. Right? So it again varies from your application and from obviously from your condition of so for just wastewater, if you're asking, then that is what I can say. So it is not, I can't rule it out yet, but it is still useful. But for scale-up aspect, it cannot.
And sir, one more query regarding that hydrodynamic instrumentation you have discussed. Sir, either it is available at the small scale, laboratory scale. You have mentioned so many things regarding 5 liter or more than that amount. Either it is a small quantity can be treated with it as a laboratory scale. I mean to say just for the 500 ml or the 50 ml student purpose.
Just, I mean, you can build it at a small scale. I have myself recently where I have joined this Department of Technology, because earlier during PhD I had a very sophisticated assembly. So here at the Department of Technology, I just did it with a small centrifugal pump, small plastic tank, and so with less than 10,000 rupees, I managed to build a small cavitation setup. But in terms of volume, it is tricky. We still have to use minimum 3 to 4 liters, because you don't get those pumps very easily, which actually generate at least 2 to 3 bar pressures, right? In order to generate 2 to 3 bar pressures, you need at least 3-4 liters, because you won't get sufficient head, right? So in terms
Okay.
of cost, it is very easy to build even with 10,000, 15,000 rupees. You can just because manufacturing ventures are maybe slightly expensive, but you can still use simple orifice plates. You just have to drill a hole in a plate. So for experimentation purpose, like you said, for students to actually understand it, it is still possible to build it very cheaply, but the volumes you still have to use at least 3 liters.
Okay, not less than 2 to 3 liter. 3 liter water has been utilized.
Yes.
No, not at all 500 ml can be.
I mean, if you somehow find the pumps which actually which actually operate at very high pressure and low flow rate, then you can. But I think it's practically not possible.
Okay, sir. And it is possible to only just BOD, COD, and TOC purposes, not for the heavy metal purposes. If the
No, because
wastewater,
we're
you have
talking about
mentioned
that.
in the dyes also, na, sir? Dyes
Yes,
can be
yes,
also treated, dye water, wastewater can also be treated. But
yes.
for the heavy metal contaminated water, we need another technology only. Na?
If your objective is to degrade the heavy metal, I don't know. You can I think you can have a technology to absorb a heavy metal, but if you're talking about oxidation, then the cavitation will be helpful.
No, sir, for the adsorptive removal.
Adsorptive removal, I don't think so, because there is no sort of adsorption. I don't think there is any adsorption which sort of takes place in this.
No, adsorption rate can be increase with the cavitation. If we add a 5 gram of material and without cavitation and after cavitation, I think the active sites will get more involved after cavitation. Na?
Well, that is a good idea. I mean, one can actually try that. So you can actually combine different adsorbents
Because we
and
are working on the bioadsorbent and removing the heavy metals. So I
right.
think that whether we can go ahead with the help of this kind of cavitation, we can perform some experiments.
It will be actually interesting to see. I mean, I haven't done it myself. Maybe someone has done it. I will have to check. But this can be done. Like you said, the active sites can get enhanced because of cavitation, and
Yes,
maybe
sir.
your adsorption rate can increase. But it will
Yes.
have to be actually. You will have to try it and see it. But that is an interesting suggestion. Thank you so much.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. May I have some discussion in future also with you, sir?
Sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. Anytime.
So I will find it out at your email.
Yes, I'll share my presentation, and I think I have my email on that. Otherwise,
Okay,
you
sir.
will get it from Somnath sir also. So, no problem.
Okay, thank you so much, sir.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shweta. Next in line, the question, hand is raised by Gauridhar Gauri. Can you please unmute yourself and ask the question to sir?
Yeah. Thank you so much for an insightful presentation, sir. Just a question. Has there been any studies carried out or any case study with regards to municipal sewage treatment plant, maybe in India or maybe in abroad? Have you carried out and seen how, how better is it in terms of efficiency than the aeration that, existing municipal corporations have in India? Would you have any case studies on it, sir?
We actually tried it. So
Okay.
not for municipal waste, we tried it only for grey water.
Okay.
Yeah, and we actually saw that it actually obviously it sort of reduces the grey water COD,
Mm-hmm.
and it sort of increases its biodegradability.
Okay.
So that is what we observed. But so this was done at only laboratory scale. So we actually we are actually in touch with a company which are actually building these large scale municipal wastewater treatment plant,
Right.
and there the idea was to actually use cavitation as a pre-treatment operation. And then it actually, because what happens is, what cavitation does is it sort of breaks down the complex molecule into smaller molecules,
Right.
and the smaller molecules into even further smaller molecules, and therefore you get COD reduction, right?
Right.
So the idea was to break down these heavy molecules into smaller molecules, so that when the water goes to aeration, that because of the aeration, the microbes will be able to degrade those pollutants very easily, right? So
Right.
if they get a complex molecule compared to if they get a broken down molecule, it will be easier for microbes to break these molecules easily. So we actually proved that at a laboratory scale. We wanted to actually try it at a larger scale, but at a larger scale, I don't know yet if someone have actually did it. But laboratory scale, yes, we actually tried it, and we found that the COD BOD ratio sort of increased, and the amount of aeration time also was reduced considerably.
Okay, so you're saying, because this concept is new to me, please correct me if I have my questions wrong. So with this cavitation technology, if we are using it at a municipal level, we might not need, maybe a tertiary treatment, yes, because chlorination would yield a better result for sure. But then after, say, a filtration like grit chambers and a cavitation technology along with chlorination would suffice. I mean, can we reduce one step at least in such a big scale, such a large scale?
Well, I can't comment like for 100% if you can remove one stage completely or not, but I can definitely say that you can reduce that time considerably. Let's say, for example, if you need, let's say, aeration, if you have to, because we are talking about millions of tons of water, right?
Right.
Yet at
Right.
a community level, at a city level. So if you are, let's say, doing aeration, let's say for 8 hours, right? Maybe you can reduce it by, let's say, 40%, 50% to 4 hours, right? Then only you get considerable reduction in efficiency, right? So if you're talking about 40-50% reduction in aeration time, then
Right.
obviously your air compressors will run for a lesser time. You can treat the double amount of water in that particular time. So obviously it can enhance the efficiency of your total treatment operation, but I can't say for with confidence that whether it will be able to actually remove the one step completely or not.
Okay, so cavitation technology does not replace aeration. Aeration still would be required. Is that what you're saying, sir?
Yes, aeration will be required, but efficiency of aeration will increase drastically.
Okay, so it still has to be used as a hybrid technology. It cannot
Yes.
be used as a standalone technology.
Yes.
And one last question, sir. Cavitation, does it require a certain retention time, or can it be on a flowing fluid? Like, can the fluid still be flowing and moving out of a tank or a clarifier, or it requires a certain amount of retention time?
That again, I think again depends on the end application.
Okay.
Right? If you're like say if your objective is just to use only cavitation, then obviously it requires certain retention time, and then you want to pass your liquid through cavitation zone number of times. But like I said, if you want to just use it as a hybrid technique, like I said, if your objective is just to combine it with some technique, then it doesn't. Then you can design a cavitation device in such a way that in your entire process you just fit a cavitation device, your liquid just passes through a cavitation device, and your flow of your process doesn't change much.
All right.
So that depends on I think application to
Yeah,
application.
application to application. All right, sir. Okay, got it, sir. Thank you so much for your answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is by, I think, Shailendra sir. Sir, please go ahead with your question.
One more question regarding if we are using the same technique in the campuses, like in our colleges, we have a zero discharge colleges. So if we add, we have some case study regarding the same, regarding the cost benefit analysis or some life cycle assessment. The combination of this technique with the existing zero campuses. Nowadays, this is compulsory for us. We have to go for the zero discharge campus.
Right.
So we are going to use the complete water within the campus, recycling
Right.
and all.
Right.
So if any case study available, if possible, please share the link in future to us. So it will be excellent to take away from for us.
Right. We actually tried it when I was doing my PhD. We actually tried it for our hostel, hostel wastewater, which was actually coming. We actually tried it, but for zero discharge, I don't think I have any sort of case study. I mean, I know, like in my college as well. Afterward, they were doing similar case study, like you said, because this is now a compulsion that uh, the colleges and institutes should be a zero discharge facility. They, so the some sort of report was under preparation, but not when I was there. So I will definitely check, and if I have some sort of a report, then I will.
This is
I personally we have done it for our hostel wastewater, and we actually did it for a society as well, a complex of 5 societies, where the objective was to actually treat all the water, the gray water and black water, and to actually utilize that gray water for gardening and flushing purposes and everything. So for that we actually did a lot of trials, and we have a lot of data regarding that. But for zero discharge, I don't think I have anything right now, but I will definitely check, and if I have something, I will definitely share with you, sir.
thank you, sir. Thank you. This is the excellent concept. We can merge it with the zero discharge, and we are able to save a lot of energy. So if we have some
Yes,
life
sir.
cycle analysis or some cost benefit analysis, it will be the good for our students. We can say they can work in this area.
Definitely, sir. Definitely, that's an interesting suggestion. I'll definitely look into it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Any other questions, please? If they have, please unmute yourself and ask question to sir. All right. If there are no further questions, then maybe we can have conclusion of this session, right? Yeah. No more question, right?
Yes.
Okay. So with this very interactive session at the end, and very detailed and elaborate presentation on cavitation. So we are very much aware of the all technologies and alternate possibilities with say cavitation process itself. So sir has Mandar sir has already given elaborate insights into this technology. So on behalf of all of us, and on behalf of this FDP organizing committee, I thank you, Dr. Mandar. So
Thank you,
thank you
sir.
so
Thank
much.
you so much. Thank you.
So of course, the show is very much on because of the all participants and audience. Yes, thank you
Yes,
so
sir.
much. Thank you,
Yes, sir.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you
sir.
for
Thank you.
being there. Thank you so
Thank
much.
thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for
Thank
some
you.
insightful deliberation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Somnath sir, we can now stop the recording of this session.